Picture yourself as a 21-year-old monarch positioned at the brink of a turbulent waterway, gazing upon an opposing force nearly double your numbers. Your most reliable commander pleads with you to fall back. Your adversaries mock you from their seemingly invincible elevated position. A single misstep could extinguish your realm before its first breath. Yet rather than withdrawing, you commit an act so bold, so daring, that its resonance will thunder through millennia. You level your weapon, drive your mount onward, and spearhead a mounted assault that defies all logic. This defining moment transformed Alexander into legend, and we're about to explore the confrontation that altered everything. But before we witness this iconic offensive, hit that subscribe button and activate notifications, because you're going to learn why this particular afternoon in 334 BC determined the fate of 3 continents. Believe me, you cannot afford to miss what unfolds. The calendar reads 334 BC, and our ancient world resembles a strategic board of competing powers, its elements suspended in extraordinary tension. For generations, one massive authority has controlled the game, the formidable Achaemenid Persian realm. This giant extends from Mediterranean coastlines deep into India's interior, weaving together countless nations and peoples, all governed by the supreme ruler dwelling in magnificent Persepolis palaces. To observers everywhere, this dominion appeared everlasting, its authority unquestionable, its riches beyond imagination. Now, however, a fresh competitor has burst onto the field. A young, untested Macedonian monarch has traversed the Hellespont into Asian territory, commanding forces that represent merely a sliver of steel against continental vastness. 35,000 warriors bearing not just their long pikes, but their nation's century-old aspiration for vengeance against the empire that once reduced Athens to ashes and humiliated Hellenic peoples for generations. Alexander, third of Macedon's line, had no business being there. By any reasonable assessment, at merely 21 years, younger than numerous soldiers in his own formations, he belonged back in his unstable homeland, navigating the delicate path of new monarchy. His responsibilities were evident: suppress the restive Greek city-states stirring southward, secure northern frontiers against tribal invasions, master the slow, grinding craft of diplomacy and governance. Yet Alexander wasn't a reasonable person. He was consumed by vision. He had depleted his coffers, mortgaged everything, and wagered his entire realm on this single audacious throw of the dice. Now he confronted his initial genuine test. The Persian governors of Asia Minor, princes of vast, prosperous territories, had assembled their armies at a location called Granicus River. They radiated absolute confidence, viewing this Macedonian upstart as trivial annoyance, a youth-playing warrior who could be crushed and dispatched across the sea in irons, terminating this foolish incursion before it truly commenced. What transpired that fateful afternoon wouldn't merely determine Alexander's invasion fate, it would reverberate through history's corridors for over 2,000 years. The engagement would become an audacity blueprint, a leadership masterclass, and a demonstration of how one decisive action's earth-shattering power could reshape everything. It would be analyzed and celebrated, whispered in military academies for centuries. But this legend balanced on the narrowest margins. The grand tapestry of conquest that would spread Greek culture to the known world's edges nearly unraveled before its first thread was woven. In the approaching chaos, Alexander would come within a single bronze inch, a single heartbeat, of perishing before his story truly began. On parchment, the Persian strategy appeared flawless, a trap seemingly crafted by war deities themselves. The governors, powerful regional administrators of Asia Minor, had gathered a brilliant host of roughly 40,000 troops. This force was anchored by its most dreaded element, 20,000 mounted warriors representing the Persian military machine's very essence. These weren't drafted riders, they were imperial nobility's sons, warriors from Media and Bactria born into saddles, trained from youth in mounted combat's brutal arts. They arrived wearing finest scaled protection and bronze helmets, a dazzling, terrifying wall of imperial might. Their genuine ace, the mind they believed would guarantee triumph, was an outsider among silk-clad nobles, a Greek soldier for hire from Rhodes named Memnon. He wasn't ordinary mercenary. Memnon possessed strategic brilliance, a chillingly precise grasp of Macedonian warfare, having fought both with and against them. He understood the devastating Sarissa phalanx power, but also its vulnerabilities. In the Persian War Council, as arrogant governors debated crushing the young invader, Memnon, the voice of harsh, practical experience, proposed a strategy that should have stopped Alexander cold. Memnon's approach was brutal and brilliant, asymmetric warfare perfection. He argued against seeking glorious direct battle. Instead, he advocated strategic retreat, a fighting withdrawal deep into Asia Minor's heartland. While falling back, they'd implement scorched earth, leaving invaders nothing. Burn crops in fields, poison wells, destroy grain stores, evacuate villages. Alexander's army, operating hundreds of miles from its nearest supply base with an already empty treasury, was a predator needing to feed. Memnon's plan would starve the beast. Cut off from all provisions, the Macedonian war machine would grind to a halt, forced into humiliating retreat or slow, agonizing starvation death. It was unglamorous, patient, and ruthlessly effective strategy that wins wars. But the plan contained one fatal weakness. It required Persian governors to destroy the very source of their immense wealth and power. These were proud aristocrats, governors of world's richest provinces, accustomed to unparalleled luxury and prestige. The notion of torching their own estates, fields, and cities was a personal and political insult they couldn't stomach. In the war council, their outrage was palpable. Arsaces, the satrap of the battle province, reportedly rose, his voice dripping aristocratic contempt, declaring he wouldn't permit a single house in his lands to be burned. His peers shared this sentiment. Moreover, their decision was poisoned by lethal arrogance. They saw Alexander not as Philip the Conqueror's heir with revolutionary forces, but as a boy king, an impetuous youth leading a barely stable kingdom. They believed whispers from Greece that his rule was fragile, this invasion a desperate gamble. They craved glory from crushing this upstart themselves, presenting the young Macedonian monarch's head to their ruler Darius III, claiming all credit. Their pride, greed, and profound opponent underestimation led them to discard the one strategy guaranteeing victory. This collective hubris would cost them everything. Thus they chose their battlefield carefully. The Granicus River, though not especially wide, was a formidable natural fortress. Centuries of spring floods had carved steep, treacherous mud-slick banks nearly impossible to climb in formation. The current itself, fed by cold mountain streams, ran swift and deep, a churning obstacle that could sweep away man or horse. From their position on the eastern bank, Persians held commanding high ground, giving unobstructed view of any approaching enemy. Their deployment reflected their arrogance directly: unconventional, risky, ultimately catastrophic. Standard military doctrine dictated infantry form the stable center with cavalry on flanks or in reserve delivering decisive blows. The Persian governors discarded the playbook. They positioned their entire elite cavalry force directly on the riverbank's lip, creating a dense, glittering bronze, iron, and horseflesh wall that seemed utterly impenetrable. Behind them, far from action on the plain, they placed Memnon's battle-hardened Greek mercenaries, the very infantry best suited for slaughtering Macedonians struggling from water. Their logic, born of pure contempt, was that Macedonians would be so disorganized and exhausted by river crossing that a single crushing downhill charge from elite cavalry would suffice for annihilation. It should have been massacre. But it was a trap built on the fatal assumption that their enemy was conventional and would follow conventional rules. When Alexander and his vanguard crested the final rise and gazed upon Granicus River, he surveyed the scene not with kingly eyes but with the cold, analytical stare of a born tactician. What he observed should have given any reasonable commander deep, chilling pause. The enemy held every conceivable advantage. Their superior numbers formed a glittering battle line calmly waiting. They held high ground, a tactical dominance position making any assault an uphill struggle. His own forces, by contrast, were weary, coated in dust and sweat from a long day's march. To order frontal assault across a fast-flowing river, up a steep muddy bank, directly into entrenched cavalry violated every sacred military principle. It was textbook suicide mission definition. Beside him stood Parmenion, the Macedonian army's most seasoned general and his late father Philip II's loyal friend. The old veteran, whose face was a roadmap of countless campaigns, was visibly appalled. This grizzled commander had fought more battles than Alexander had lived years, and his experienced eye immediately grasped the Persian trap's lethal geometry. He turned to his young king, voice urgent and weighted with concern, strongly advising against immediate attack. He argued for making camp, resting, and launching dawn assault. A night's delay, he reasoned, could change everything. They might find an undefended upstream crossing, or Persians might grow complacent and abandon their perfect formation. His counsel was logical, prudent, absolutely correct military advice in any conventional sense. The advice wasn't just militarily sound, it was a plea from someone who viewed Alexander as both king and son. But the young monarch rejected it utterly, without hesitation.
He turned to his worried general, his expression not of anger but of unshakable resolve, and uttered words that would define the moment. He declared that the Hellespont, the great sea he'd just crossed, would blush with shame if he, having conquered a strait, were frightened by a mere stream like Granicus. The dismissal was so swift, so absolute, it must have shocked assembled officers. It was clear signal that Philip's old, cautious ways were finished and a new, more audacious warfare era had begun. This wasn't simply arrogant youth's bravado. It was profoundly calculated psychological warfare and leadership. Alexander possessed an innate, almost supernatural understanding that momentum was his invasion's lifeblood. He knew any hesitation, any pause to make camp would poison his enemies across the river. It would be seen as fear, confirming their belief he was just a boy. Their confidence would harden overnight, discipline would tighten, they might even receive reinforcements. To his own men, delay would plant doubt's first seeds. His army was a fragile coalition of Macedonians and skeptical Greeks, held together by his personality's force and belief in his destiny. To show fear now would be admitting potential failure. More fundamentally, Alexander understood this single decision here and now would forge his reputation for his entire campaign. He stood at a crossroads between two leadership types. He could be cautious, conventional king winning through methodical planning and attrition, Parmenian's way, or he could be something else entirely. A heroic warrior king, a force of nature achieving the impossible through sheer audacity and personal valor. He knew legends aren't built on caution. Dawn victory would be simple military achievement. Victory now, against all odds, would be miraculous. It would create an invincibility aura around him that would become a weapon more powerful than any spear. Therefore, the decision to attack immediately was quintessential Alexander, the first true demonstration of the lethal formula that would carry him across the known world. It was sublime fusion of tactical insight and instinct for his foe's psychology, a belief that an enemy's greatest strength could transform into their greatest weakness. He looked at the perfect Persian defensive line and saw not an unbreakable wall but a static, arrogant target waiting to be shattered. He was betting everything, his army, kingdom, life, and legacy, on his unwavering belief that audacity itself was the sharpest weapon in his arsenal, capable of carving victory's path where all other commanders saw only certain defeat. The tension is mounting, isn't it? Alexander's about to make a decision that will either create his legend or end it before it begins. But first, tell me in the comments, do you think Alexander's refusal to wait was brilliant strategy or reckless gambling? And don't forget to hit that like button if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal moments. The army Alexander led into Asia was numerically small, a mere fraction of the vast host Persia could summon, but it was no simple barbarian horde. It was a professional combined arms military force representing the absolute pinnacle of ancient military evolution. The heart and soul of this machine was its infantry, the Macedonian phalanx battalions. 6,000 of these hardened professionals, organized into 6 elite units called taxis, formed the unbreakable center. They were the product of a lifetime of grueling training and the revolutionary military reforms of Alexander's father, Philip II. Each man carried the fearsome 18-foot sarissa, a pike so long it required 2 hands to wield, creating a dense hedgehog of spear points that was all but invincible in frontal assault. On flat ground of a traditional battlefield, the phalanx was a human steamroller, a nearly impenetrable wall of bronze-tipped death that could grind any opposing infantry force into dust. But this wasn't a traditional battlefield. Crossing a fast-flowing river under enemy fire, then charging up a muddy fortified embankment, was a task for which the phalanx was uniquely ill-suited. Its strength lay in cohesion and formation, both of which would be shattered by the river. For this assault, the phalanx would not be the tip of the spear, but the iron shaft that would follow. Alexander would need to rely on more flexible and elite tools in his military arsenal to forge a path for them. The army was deployed with specific, deadly purpose in mind. On the left flank, under veteran Parmenian's steady, cautious command, Alexander positioned the heavy cavalry of his Greek allies, most notably the Thessalian horsemen. The Thessalians were legendary throughout the Hellenic world, master horsemen whose skill in the saddle was second only to the Macedonians themselves. Their mission was crucial but defensive. They were to act as an anchor, engaging and pinning the Persian right wing. Their job was not seeking glorious breakthrough, but holding ground at all costs, preventing the numerically superior enemy from enveloping the Macedonian line or reinforcing the main attack point. In the center, the 6 phalanx battalions were arrayed, their forest of sarissas held upright, waiting in disciplined reserve on the Macedonian riverside. They wouldn't move until Alexander himself had punched a hole in the Persian line and secured a foothold on the opposite bank. The entire battle weight, the invasion's fate itself, rested not on infantry but on cavalry success. It was on the right flank where the real striking force, the decisive weapon, was being assembled. Here Alexander gathered his army's absolute cream, a perfectly calibrated force designed for a single overwhelming hammer blow. Here were the hypaspists, the shield-bearers, his personal foot guards, who served as the flexible hinge between cavalry and phalanx. They were elite warriors combining a hoplite's discipline and armor with a skirmisher's speed and mobility. Alongside them were his Agranian javelin men, fierce mountain warriors from the Balkans who could traverse the roughest terrain like ghosts. And at the very tip of this spear was Macedonia's pride, the most feared and respected cavalry unit in the ancient world, the Companion Cavalry. These 2,000 horsemen were sons of the Macedonian aristocracy, nobles raised at court with Alexander, who had trained with him since boyhood and were bound to him by an unbreakable loyalty oath. The companions weren't merely soldiers fighting for a king. They were a brotherhood of warriors fighting for one of their own, a band of brothers sharing his burning ambition for glory and conquest. Their loyalty was absolute, their courage unquestioned, and their battlefield synergy was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was here, at the head of this elite unit, that Alexander made a decision so remarkable, so contrary to kingship norms, that it sent a visible shockwave through both armies. Instead of commanding from a safe rear position, as was customary for any sane general or king, he rode to the very front of the lead squadron, placing himself at the charging wedge's apex. He wouldn't simply order the attack. He would be the first man across the river, the first to feel water spray, the first to meet enemy steel. This single act revealed the very essence of Alexander's almost mythical leadership. He understood a profound truth of men in combat. Courage is a fire, and it spreads from the top down. He knew men will gladly walk into death's jaws for a leader who asks nothing of them that he isn't willing to do himself. By placing his own life in the most extreme and immediate danger, he transformed the coming charge from mere tactical maneuver into sacred duty. His men wouldn't just be fighting for victory. They'd be fighting with the desperate, frenzied valor of soldiers whose every action was dedicated to protecting their beloved king's life. The battle didn't begin with the thunderous head-on collision Persians expected. It began instead with subtle, calculated, masterful deception. With a quiet command, Alexander dispatched a small hand-picked force of light infantry and a cavalry squadron under an officer named Socrates. This advance guard, perhaps no more than 300 men, was ordered to charge across the river, but significantly upstream from Alexander's main position on the right flank. With a disciplined roar, this sacrificial unit plunged into the churning river. Shields held high as they fought the current, and scrambled up the opposite bank directly into the strongest part of the waiting Persian line. The Persian commanders reacted with the predictable arrogance Alexander had counted on. Seeing a small force attacking their strongest point, they believed this was the main, albeit suicidal, Macedonian assault. Eager to crush the attack and claim easy victory, Persian cavalry squadrons from center and left converged on the assault point, abandoning their prepared positions to overwhelm the small Macedonian force. The fighting on the riverbank was brief, brutal, and utterly one-sided. The outnumbered Macedonians were annihilated, driven back into the river with horrific casualties. Men were impaled by javelins, pulled from horses into swift current, and drowned under their own armor's weight. But in their heroic deaths, they had accomplished their mission with perfect lethal precision. They had drawn the entire Persian army's eye. The Persian commanders, their attention now tunnel-visioned on this single action point, were completely fixated on the wrong battlefield part. Crucially, their elite cavalry squadrons had shifted, clustering into a dense, disorganized mass to deal with the decoy. In doing so, they had fatally weakened and exposed their own center-left line, creating the exact vulnerability point Alexander had been waiting for. It was a classic magician's trick, forcing the audience to look at one hand while the other prepares the real deadly maneuver. While Persians were still congratulating themselves on repelling the first assault, Alexander unleashed his true attack. With a single sharp command, he spurred his own horse forward, leading the entire companion cavalry not in a straight line but in a diagonal charge across the river. This oblique angle was genius. It was the shortest path to the weakened enemy section and gave Persians minimum possible reaction time. The famous companion wedge formation, an arrowhead of steel and courage designed to punch through enemy lines, plunged into the river with Alexander himself at its very tip. The sight must have been terrifyingly sublime. Alexander, a figure of almost divine radiance in his polished bronze cuirass and distinctive helmet adorned with two large white plumes, was an unmistakable beacon leading the charge. He spurred his legendary warhorse Bucephalus into the churning, chest-deep water without a flicker of hesitation. Behind him, a wave of over 1,000 of Macedonia's finest nobles crashed into the river, their thunderous battle cry of Enialios, an invocation to the war god echoing across the valley. The sound alone was a weapon, a declaration that this was no mere feint. This was the hammer blow, and it was aimed directly at the Persian army's heart. The crossing itself was a maelstrom of organized chaos. The powerful Granicus current threatened to tear the wedge formation apart as horses struggled for footing on the rocky riverbed, and riders fought to maintain cohesion under a relentless Persian javelin storm. The air was thick with projectile hiss and water splash as men and animals were struck. The steep, muddy bank on the Persian side was a treacherous final obstacle, causing horses to slip and fall, throwing heavily armored riders into water to drown. The perfect, disciplined arrowhead that entered the river began to fragment under the sheer brutal crossing stress. But Alexander's timing, the result of a predatory instinct for battle rhythm, was flawless. The Persian commanders, their eyes still drawn to the upstream feint, took precious seconds to comprehend the true threat nature now emerging from water directly before them. By the time they frantically shouted orders and tried to wheel their disorganized cavalry squadrons to face the real attack, it was already too late. Alexander and the first companion wave had weathered the storm. They had reached the bank and were scrambling up the slippery slope, a snarling, desperate mass of men and horses still led by their indomitable king. The trap had been sprung, and the jaws were about to close. Section 5: The Moment of Truth. The very instant the first companion hooves found purchase on the high riverbank, the battle degenerated into savage close-quarters melee. This was cavalry combat at its most primal and deadly, a swirling, claustrophobic vortex of stabbing lances, slashing swords, rearing horses, and desperate men's screams. The Macedonians wielded their superior Zeiston, a 12-foot lance of tough cornel wood, giving them crucial reach advantage and shocking power over Persians who primarily used lighter throwing javelins. But in the chaotic, churning life-or-death press where there was no room to maneuver, such tactical advantages could vanish in a heartbeat. True to his word and nature, Alexander was a destruction whirlwind at the fighting's heart, a beacon of ferocious energy leading from the absolute front. He wasn't just a king, he was a predator, his eyes scanning enemy ranks for high-value targets. He immediately identified Mithridates, son-in-law of Persian King Darius himself, and spurred Bucephalus directly at him. There was no hesitation. In a single explosive charge, Alexander drove his lance through the Persian noble's shield, through his armor deep into his chest, killing him instantly. But in this lethal triumph moment, as he wrenched his weapon free from his fallen foe, disaster struck. Alexander found himself suddenly, terrifyingly isolated. His forward momentum had carried him deep into a pocket of enraged Persian nobles. He was now a lone target for two of their most powerful satraps, Rosaces and Spithridates. At that exact moment, his lance shaft, strained by the fatal blow to Mithridates, shattered in his hands, leaving him momentarily defenseless with only a sword. Rosaces, seeing his chance, charged and swung a heavy battle axe with all his might. The blow caught Alexander's helmet with a deafening metal clang. The sheer force sheared off the iconic white plumes, cracked the thick bronze helmet itself, and sent a blinding concussive shock through the young king's entire body. Stunned and reeling, the world swimming before his eyes, Alexander struggled to stay on his horse as Rosaces raised his axe again for the final killing blow. Spithridates maneuvered his horse to attack the dazed king from behind, his curved Persian scimitar glinting in afternoon sun as he prepared to deliver the fatal strike. For one agonizing, suspended moment, Western civilization's entire future hung by a single fragile thread. If Alexander died here in this provincial riverbank mud, his invasion would collapse into chaos. His kingdom of Macedonia would likely fragment into civil war, and the mighty Persian Empire would continue its unchallenged dominance for generations. World history would be rewritten. But in that critical final second, one of Alexander's companions, Cleitus the Black, a man who had grown up with his king, crashed into the fray like a thunderbolt. Seeing his king's peril, Cleitus galloped through chaos with single-minded purpose. Just as Spithridates' sword began its downward arc, Cleitus, with a single powerful sweep of his own blade, severed the Persian satrap's arm at the shoulder. The limb, still clutching its sword, spun through air. The Persian noble's shriek of pure agony was swallowed by the battle's deafening roar. But his dramatic fall from horse marked the psychological turning point of the entire engagement. The sight of several of their most powerful commanders being cut down in single combat, combined with Alexander's personal charge's sheer terrifying ferocity, began shattering Persian morale. These were proud, brave men fighting for their honor and land, but they were confronted with a phenomenon defying their entire warfare understanding. They were facing a king who fought not like a distant commander but like a ferocious berserker from the heroic age, a leader backed by an army whose absolute loyalty and devotion bordered on fanatical. Their confidence foundation began to crack, and terror's seed was planted. Perhaps this wasn't a mere mortal they were fighting, but a war demigod itself. Section 6: The Collapse. The magnificent Persian cavalry line, which only moments before had seemed like an unbreakable, glittering wall of imperial power, began to groan and buckle under the relentless, focused Macedonian assault pressure. The initial breakthrough, carved out by Alexander and his royal squadron, was like a crack appearing in thick ice. For a moment it was a localized rupture, but the companions, fighting with the fury of men defending their king, relentlessly exploited the opening, widening it with every spear thrust. The fracture spread rapidly, running down the Persian line as first one noble squadron then another recoiled from the Macedonians' sheer ferocity and began giving ground. The psychological impact of seeing their most powerful satraps and commanders slain in single combat by Alexander himself cannot be overstated. In the ancient world, warfare wasn't merely tactical exercise, it was deeply spiritual and superstitious. Battles were often seen as trials by combat between opposing armies' gods. Alexander's miraculous survival from a direct axe blow to the head, coupled with his visible personal slaughter of their finest champions, created a powerful, terrifying narrative. The impression rippled through Persian ranks with panic speed. The gods themselves were clearly fighting for the young Macedonian king. This wasn't a fair fight, it was divine judgment, and they were on the losing side. The final collapse, when it came, wasn't gradual retreat but sudden, catastrophic morale implosion. The elite cavalry, moments before confident in their impregnable position and superior numbers, shattered in a blind panic wave. What had been an organized, disciplined defensive line disintegrated into a terrified, disorganized mob of thousands of fleeing horsemen. They streamed away from the riverbank and across the open plain, each man desperately fighting his way through the press of his own comrades in frantic flight for his life. The river battle was over. The slaughter was about to begin. Alexander, his helmet cracked and body bloodied but spirit blazing with victory, didn't pause to celebrate. He immediately unleashed his cavalry in relentless, merciless pursuit of the routing enemy. This was standard brutal ancient warfare doctrine, taught to him by his father. A broken army is most vulnerable during retreat, and it's during the chase that victory transforms into annihilation. The companion cavalry, their blood still singing from the fight's ferocity, spurred their weary horses onward. They pursued fleeing Persians for miles across countryside, cutting them down from behind with methodical, terrifying efficiency, turning Phrygia's green plains red with enemy blood. As the pursuit chaos unfolded, the 10,000 Greek mercenaries found themselves in a sudden, utterly impossible position. These were professional, battle-hardened hoplites, the Persian army's anchor, held in reserve on the plain behind the river. According to the original Persian plan, they were supposed to be the anvil upon which the cavalry hammer would smash the Macedonians. Instead, they could only watch in stunned horror as their cavalry support evaporated in a dust cloud, and their Persian employers abandoned them to their fate. They were now an infantry island, completely isolated in a sea of victorious Macedonians. These mercenaries weren't cowards. They were grizzled veterans of countless brutal campaigns across the Greek world, men who sold their spears to the highest bidder. They quickly formed into defensive posture, a solid block of shields and spears ready to fight. Under normal circumstances, as fellow Greeks, they expected to negotiate for honorable surrender terms, perhaps to be ransomed or even offered a place in the victor's army. But they were about to discover that Alexander, in this moment of absolute triumph, was in no mood for conventional Hellenic warfare courtesies. To him, they were not just enemies, they were something far worse. What unfolded on the plain in the cavalry battle's aftermath revealed a colder, harder, and far more ruthless side of Alexander's character, a trait that would emerge time and again throughout his long, bloody conquest of Asia. As the victorious Macedonian cavalry returned from their pursuit, the great phalanx battalions finally crossed the Granicus unopposed. They methodically deployed on the plain, their lines perfectly dressed, their sarissas lowered to form a dense, impenetrable steel forest. They moved with chilling mechanical precision, completely encircling the trapped Greek mercenaries. Seeing death's ring closing around them, the veteran hoplites, knowing the fight was lost, grounded their spears and attempted to negotiate surrender terms. From Alexander's perspective, however, this was not negotiation between honorable opponents. He looked upon the surrounded men not as enemy soldiers but as something far more contemptible. They were traitors to the entire Hellenic world. These were Greeks who had taken the Persian king's blood money, pledging their spears to the very empire that had desecrated Greek temples and sought to enslave their people. They were a direct affront to the grand Panhellenic crusade of revenge that served as his invasion's entire moral and political justification. In his mind's cold calculus, they had forfeited their right to be treated as Greeks. They deserved no mercy. The mercenaries, grizzled professionals who could read a battlefield's grim language, quickly realized the depth of their peril. Desperation set in. They sent forth envoys, pleading their case, trying every diplomatic avenue they could conceive. They offered handsome ransom for their lives. They offered to switch allegiance and serve loyally in Alexander's own army, their combat experience a valuable asset. They appealed to shared Hellenic warfare customs, which traditionally allowed for captured soldiers' ransoming. But the young king, his face set like stone, remained utterly inflexible. His response was delivered without negotiation, unconditional surrender or total annihilation. What followed wasn't a battle in any meaningful sense. It was methodical, industrial-scale slaughter. Enraged by what he saw as their treason, Alexander dismounted and reportedly led his infantry on foot in the final brutal assault. The Macedonian phalanx advanced from all sides, a slowly contracting death circle. The mercenaries, armed with their much shorter 8-foot hoplite spears, were tactically helpless. They couldn't break through the dense wall of 18-foot sarissas, nor could they get close enough to effectively use their own weapons. It was horrific, one-sided extermination as the Macedonians systematically butchered the trapped, helpless men. Ancient historical accounts, though varying in exact numbers, paint a grim carnage picture. Of the roughly 10,000 professional Greek soldiers who had stood on that plain, only 2,000 survived the massacre. These weren't ransomed or treated as prisoners of war. They were stripped of arms and armor, bound in chains, and sent back to Macedon to live out the rest of their miserable lives as slaves, condemned to hard labor in the silver mines. The message to the rest of the Greek world was as clear as it was terrifying. If you fight for Persia, if you betray the Hellenic cause, you can expect no quarter from Alexander. This calculated, ruthless brutality act was far more than simple vengeful rage. It served several key strategic purposes. Firstly, it sent a chilling warning to every other Greek mercenary serving in the vast Persian Empire, forcing them to question their loyalty. Secondly, it demonstrated to the fiercely independent and often rebellious mainland Greek city-states that there would be severe, immediate consequences for collaborating with their old enemy. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, it forged a new, fearsome dimension to Alexander's reputation. It established him in allies' and enemies' minds alike as a leader of stark dualities, a man of incredible generosity and loyalty to his friends, but one of absolute, merciless brutality to those he deemed traitors. Section 8: The Victory and its Consequences. As the last sun rays set over Granicus River on that fateful spring day in 334 BC, the light illuminated a scene of almost unimaginable carnage and the dawn of a new era. The ancient world had been irrevocably altered in the space of a single brutal afternoon. Alexander had not only achieved what seemed impossible, but had shattered the very foundation of Persian power in the West. He had confronted and utterly destroyed the first great army the Persian Empire had sent against him, effectively eliminating in one stroke virtually all organized military resistance to his Asia Minor invasion. The path into the empire's heartland now lay open. The stark, chilling casualty figure arithmetic tells the battle's completely one-sided conclusion story. Persian losses were nothing short of catastrophic. Thousands of their finest aristocratic cavalry lay dead on the field, a generation of the region's nobility wiped out. Their entire professional mercenary infantry corps, the hardened backbone of their army, had been annihilated to a man. Most critically, the satraps and high commanders who had so arrogantly dismissed the young king were almost all dead, fallen in battle chaos. By stunning contrast, Macedonian casualties were almost miraculously light. Ancient sources claim perhaps just over 100 of Alexander's men were killed in total, the majority of those losses coming from the heroic sacrificial feint that had initiated battle. But the true world-altering significance of Granicus' victory went far beyond the dead's grim calculus. This battle was Alexander's first and most critical test as supreme independent commander, and he had passed it with breathtaking audacity. He had proven to his men, to his enemies, and to himself that he could lead an army into a seemingly impossible tactical situation and emerge completely victorious. He had demonstrated combined arms mastery, psychological warfare genius, and a personal courage level bordering on the divine. The legend forged in the blood and mud of Granicus would now become his vanguard, a terror, and awe wave that would precede him into every future campaign, often compelling enemies to surrender before a single sword was even drawn. The victory's political consequences were immediate, seismic, and far-reaching. With the Persian field army utterly destroyed and its leadership decapitated, the wealthy Greek cities dotting Asia Minor's coast found themselves suddenly, completely defenseless. The imperial authority that had governed their lives for generations had vanished overnight. One by one, great cities like Sardis and Ephesus would throw open their gates to Alexander, their populations often welcoming him not as conqueror, but as liberator from Persian rule's yoke. For others, it was simple pragmatic recognition that any and all resistance was now utterly futile against this new, seemingly invincible power. More importantly, Granicus' victory established the very leadership and strategy patterns that would come to define Alexander's entire legendary career. His willingness to accept and even seek out enormous personal risks to inspire his men. His innate ability to cultivate fanatical, almost religious loyalty in his troops. His lethal combination of dazzling tactical brilliance on the battlefield and cold, ruthless pragmatism in its aftermath. All these genius core traits were on full display at Granicus. They would be repeated and amplified on grander scale in even greater battles yet to come, at Issus, Gaugamela, and beyond. Finally, the battle sent a profound shockwave through the age's geopolitical landscape. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, which had stood as the world's preeminent superpower for over 2 centuries, had been revealed to be a vulnerable colossus. The old established engagement rules, which relied on overwhelming numerical superiority and holding positional advantage, had been proven catastrophically inadequate. Persia had just been introduced to a new, terrifying warfare paradigm, one waged by a leader who fused tactical innovation with a brand of inspirational personal leadership that seemed to belong to the hero's age. The world had been put on notice. A new and far more dangerous predator was now on the hunt. Granicus River battle was far more than mere military victory. It was a crucible, the precise, fiery moment in which Alexander III of Macedon, the promising but unproven young king, was burned away, and from the ashes Alexander the Great was truly born. Before that bloody afternoon, he had been a monarch with grand, almost fantastical ambition and deeply uncertain prospects. He was Philip's son, a leader with powerful inheritance but no legend of his own. But after he spurred his horse into that river, after he took an axe to the helmet and emerged victorious, he became something else entirely. He was transformed into a mythical figure, a living legend whose very name would soon become a weapon capable of striking terror into his enemies' hearts and inspiring fervent, unshakable devotion in his followers. The battle story, in all its dramatic and heroic details, spread like wildfire across the ancient world. It traveled along dusty caravan routes, was carried on merchant ships' decks, and was recounted in distant kings' courts by stunned diplomats and awestruck soldiers. Each retelling inevitably amplified the most legendary details. The impossible odds, the charge's suicidal nature, the sheer personal courage of the king who fought at the very front, the almost contemptuous destruction of the Persian host. Within months, from ancient Egypt's temples to India's royal courts, rulers and commoners alike were hearing whispered, incredible accounts of the young Western king who seemed to be Achilles reincarnated, a warrior who led his own cavalry charges and was seemingly incapable of losing a battle. This carefully cultivated and rapidly spreading reputation would become one of Alexander's most potent and effective weapons, a force multiplier as valuable as any phalanx. In years to come, future enemies would march to face him already half defeated, their morale eroded by the terrifying legend that preceded him. They knew they were facing not just a skilled general, but a man who seemed to enjoy the gods' direct protection. Conversely, potential allies and undecided city-states would flock to his banners, eager to attach their fortunes to a leader who seemed to be a certain victory avatar. He was no longer just a man waging war. He was a destiny force, and it was far better to be on his side than in his path. The profound psychological impact on Alexander himself was equally significant and transformative. This stunning Granicus success, achieved against all conventional wisdom, served as irrefutable confirmation of his deepest, most secret beliefs about himself. It solidified his conviction that he was not like other men, that he was indeed a destiny child, chosen and favored by gods for the singular purpose of world conquest. This supreme, almost terrifying self-confidence would become the engine driving him forward through a decade of relentless warfare, pushing him across scorching deserts and over frozen mountains, sustaining him through victories and near disasters that would have shattered any lesser man's will and spirit. But perhaps most importantly, Granicus' victory established the definitive, unshakable template for the leadership style that would define his entire career. It was on this day that Alexander learned, in the most visceral and immediate way possible, a set of lessons that would become his guiding principles. He had proven that audacity could shatter caution. He had learned that profound personal courage could overcome significant numerical disadvantage. And he had discovered that a single decisive action, delivered at the perfect psychological moment, could completely reshape the entire strategic landscape. The boy who charged across the river had become a man who now knew with absolute certainty how he would conquer the world. The end. In the final analysis, the Granicus River charge was many things at once. It was a tactical masterpiece of timing and deception. It was a stunning propaganda victory that announced his arrival on the world stage. And it was a moment of supreme, almost unbelievable personal courage. But above all else, it was the single brilliant spark that ignited one of the most extraordinary careers in all of human history. In his deliberate choice to attack immediately, in his profound decision to place himself at the very front of the charge, and in his defiant refusal to accept the conventional wisdom of what was possible, Alexander had broadcast an unmistakable message to the entire world. The old rules were broken, and a new and terrifying force of history had arrived. The 21-year-old king who plunged his warhorse into Granicus's churning waters that afternoon would, in the decade that followed, completely redraw the known world's map. He would shatter the Persian Empire, march his armies to India's edge, found dozens of cities that would become culture beacons for centuries, and unleash the historical tidal wave of Hellenism that would forever change Western and Eastern civilization's course. But that entire world-altering avalanche began here, with a single stone of audacious decision-making. It all hinged on one desperate cavalry charge that, by every sane calculation, should have ended in nothing but disaster. Granicus' battle serves as a timeless, brutal lesson that history's most monumental achievements often demand rejection of the safe, sensible, and conventional choice. Alexander could have listened to Parmenion, the voice of logic and experience. He could have waited for Dawn's safety, sought a less defended crossing, and followed prudent, orthodox war rules. Instead, he chose to gamble everything he had, his life, army, kingdom, on his own ferocious belief that he could turn hopeless disadvantage into history-making victory through his will's sheer unstoppable force and his tactical mind's brilliance. Was it reckless? By any rational standard, it was strategic insanity. Could his entire career and life have been extinguished in that riverbank melee? Without question. If Cletus the Black had been a second slower, the name Alexander would be a forgotten footnote. But it's the very magnitude of that risk that makes the story legendary. It teaches us that sometimes the razor-thin line between obscurity and immortality is drawn in a single heart-stopping moment. A moment when a leader must choose courage over caution, immediate action over prolonged hesitation, and the seemingly impossible over the merely difficult. And so, as we face our own challenges in a world of complexity and uncertainty, perhaps we can draw a sliver of inspiration from that young king standing at a muddy river's edge thousands of years ago. The dust of a long march was on his armor, and his kingdom's future's entire weight was on his shoulders. He knew everything he had ever worked for hung in the balance, and yet he chose to charge forward anyway. He didn't charge because it was safe, but because it was necessary for the legend he wished to create. He didn't charge because success was guaranteed, but because true greatness never is. What do you think? Was Alexander's Granicus charge the mark of military genius, or was he just incredibly lucky that his reckless gamble paid off? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more epic tales from history. Next week we'll be exploring another moment when everything hung in the balance and one person's decision changed the world forever. Until then, keep charging forward, and I'll see you in the next one.